Hi there, it's Steve Bimson here from Joined Up Marketing. Seeing that the content on this page is all about video marketing, it seemed entirely appropriate to actually record a video. So here we are. Now the aim of the content on this page and in this video is to persuade you to embrace video and to start using it in your marketing if you're not already using it. And if you're using it a little bit, to start using it a little bit more. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. I could give you loads of stats. There are a plethora of them. For example, if you take pages that have a video on them and compare them to the same kind of pages that don't, there's a huge increase in engagement in the amount of time people stay on the page where there's a video. If you sell products or services and you have an online sales page, if you add a video that supports the sale of that product or service, you will get a dramatic increase in the conversion rate. You'll sell more products. We know this from testing and measuring, but it isn't about the stats. The stats, if you like, are just symptoms. What we're concerned with here is the underlying principle behind all this. And it's a principle that affects influence, it affects persuasion, and it affects why people buy. And we need to understand what's at play there when this is happening. So when people make a change of heart or they make a decision, 90% of that decision comes from emotion. It's about how they feel about the situation inside. The stats account for the logic. And we only need about 10% or a little bit more in some cases of logic in order to support that feeling and that instinct. Then the decision gets made. So if all we do is share with you a load of stats, to be honest with you, it's not going to persuade many people of anything. There's a small number that it might influence, but in the main, it's not going to work. So we need to look at this principle. And to explain this principle, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about a professor, Albert Barabian, who was professor of psychology at the University of California. And in 1967, he did some really interesting research into communication. Now, one of the things we have to understand about communication when it's face-to-face, because that's what he was talking about, is there are actually three elements to it. So we have the words that we use is element number one. Our voice and the way we use our voice, so changes in pace, in volume, in intonation, all of those things have an impact on our communication. And then the third element is facial expression and body language. And he did several studies, and the net result was that he came up with some percentages as to which parts of the three elements of communication are most important. And the stats that he came up with are that the words only account for 7% of the meaning. Our voice accounts for 38%, and our facial expression or body language accounts for the other 55%. Now, these statistics have kind of been whitewashed and applied to all kinds of communication, or even every kind of communication. And the truth is that's not the case. It applies to a very specific type of communication, which was what Professor Barabian was actually studying. And the focus has been completely lost. It was very, very specific. So whilst we have three elements to our communication, there are two basic types: congruent communication and incongruent communication. Now, what congruency means is that when those three elements, words, voice, facial expression, body language, when they are completely aligned, singing from the same hymn sheet, giving out and communicating the same message, we accept the words and the meaning of the words 100%. Incongruent communication is when the words, the voice, and the facial expression and body language are not completely aligned in some way. Now, we don't notice this consciously, it's very much a subconscious thing. But what happens when communication is incongruent is we don't trust the words. And there are a couple of examples that I can give you. I've never come across anybody who hasn't experienced both of these, so I hope you can relate to them. But two very specific examples where you will have experienced incongruent communication and the effect that it has on you. So the first one, I want you to imagine or think back to a time when you were talking to a loved one or a really good friend, somebody you knew really, really well, and you said to them, "Hey, hi, how are you?" And they said, "Yeah, great," but you didn't believe them. You immediately knew that wasn't true. That's because you sensed incongruency in their communication. There was something in their voice or their facial expression or body language that didn't support the words. And so you immediately, even though you know, love and trust them, you didn't believe them. That's how incongruency works. The second situation is another one that everybody's experienced, is a sales situation where you're looking potentially at buying a reasonably expensive product of some sort. Might be a car, it could be anything really. And you're talking to a salesperson, everything they say makes logical sense. It all seems to add up, but there's something inside you that just sort of says, no, this isn't for me, or it doesn't feel right. That again is what happens when you experience incongruent communication. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, we are judging people and their communication all the time, even the people we know and love. And it just happens. It's a subconscious thing. We're not doing it consciously. It's all about the feeling that we get. And if we experience incongruency, we sense something, we simply don't trust the words. So what difference does this make to your marketing? Well, I'm going to tell you another story which takes me back to when I was a director consultant for BNI. I used to do all of the trainings in Hampshire, all the workshops that BNI ran. I used to run all of the visitor days for the different chapters. And I also launched new chapters. And we had a very specific process that we followed when we were either launching a chapter or running a visitor day. I'm not going to go into all of the details because there's a lot more to it, but I'm just going to tell you essentially what happened and the effects that it had in terms of the three different elements of communication. Basically on a visitor day, or let's talk about a launch instead actually. Thinking about a launch, we would get to 20 members, we would then launch a chapter. And so we'd ask each of the 20 members to send out 40 invitations to prospective new members who are in business categories that we know we want that are vacant within the chapter. Everybody would obviously invite people they knew first and foremost, but we gave every member 2 different business categories, perhaps architects and accountants, for instance, so that once they'd invited the people they knew, they could top up to 40 with people they didn't know. We always encourage them to contact people, make a phone call just to make sure they're sending it to the right person. But then we would send out 40 targeted invitations from each member. 20 members, 800 invitations. If we had a launch day taking place on a Wednesday, 2 weeks before on the Wednesday, I would send out the invitations. So the members would bring all of their invitations into the meeting, all labelled, all addressed, all up in an envelope. I'd have the stamps, we'd have a stamping session, and then I'd take away 800 invitations to the post office and send them out on that day. The process was, the next step was the following Wednesday. So we've got first Wednesday, send out the invitations. A week later on a Wednesday, we do a first follow-up call just to make sure people have received the invitation. And then the couple of days before the actual meeting, so the Monday, Tuesday, we'd make calls to finalise numbers because it's a catered event and we would have to prepare for breakfast and know who was coming. So here's the statistics. When we used to post out the invitations, I could guarantee that in that period, 8 people, that's 1%, 8 people would ring up to say, yes, got your invitation, thanks, I'd love to come. 1%. When we did the 2-step follow-up process on the phone, the first week we'd just check to make sure they received the invitation, and then we'd ring them again on the Monday/Tuesday before the meeting on the Wednesday to confirm whether or not they were coming. Our response rate went up from 1% to somewhere between 12 and 15%. From 1% to 12 to 15%. That's the difference between the words only and then the words and the voice supporting one another. Now, what we also did with members is we would say, if you find yourself running around and you've got a note of who you've invited and you're driving along and you happen to pass where they are, call in. Just say, I thought I'd drop in. Did you get the invitation? Are you coming? And what we then found is when people were invited face-to-face, that conversion rate increased again to somewhere between the third and 45%. So if you use the words only, you would get a 1% response. Words and the voice, a 12 to 15% response. But if you actually did it face-to-face, so they had the body language, facial expression as well, that would increase again to somewhere between 33 and 45% in terms of conversion. And that's massive in terms of the effect that it can have on your marketing. And this is why the stats don't matter. The stats are just symptoms. They reflect what's happening because of the improvements in communication. And the reality is we're judging people all the time, even those that we know and love, but we're judging them in a way that if we judge them to be congruent in the communication, the relationships we have build much more quickly. Confidence and trust in people builds much more quickly. And this happens more readily when we're face to face, but more importantly, because video gives you access to all three elements of communication, the difference between face to face and through video is actually very, very small indeed. For most people, it's just as good. So the reality is here, it's not about the stats. It doesn't matter how many stats I give you, that won't persuade you to want to embrace video and use it in your marketing. But understanding exactly how it works, making and understanding that emotional connection, I hope will make you want to do something about it. If you do, you'll find something at the bottom of the page where you can actually get in touch with us if you want to. But if you just run away and do something with this and start embracing video, the impact that you'll have on your marketing will actually surprise you. You'll be blown away. It can be incredibly powerful. I should add, as a final thought, that execution is everything. So don't judge your first results as being the final thing. We just get better and better and better the more that we do it. But most importantly, have some fun with it. Anyway, that's me, Steve Bibson from Joined Up Marketing. Thanks for watching the video and hope to see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.